So good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Frank Alexander. I live here in the beautiful state of California. I've been in the financial industry for over 10 years. Tonight is not about me, it's all about you. So it's truly a privilege to have you here as we discuss some incredible, important topics that can significantly impact your financial future. As many of you know, estate planning is not just about protecting your assets today, but about ensuring they are secured for generations to come. It is about having a strategy in place to safeguard your wealth, minimize unnecessary risk, and avoid unnecessary taxes. This evening, we have the honor of hearing from an expert who has helped individuals and families, churches, businesses, and various organizations navigate this process with confidence. Our attorney this evening is Glenn Wagstaff. Although you may have read about Glenn in the past, let me recount some of Glenn's accomplishments. Glenn has received widespread recognition, earning over 30 Best Managing Attorney Awards. I repeat, 30 Best Managing Attorney Awards. 8 International Best U.S. Estate Planner Awards, and numerous leadership accolades. As the founder and managing partner of Intervivios PLLC, the nation's largest estate planning law firm, Glenn is also a highly regarded speaker, author, and coach. In addition to offering high-level consultation to domestic and international businesses, he dedicates much of his practice to assisting business owners with tax strategies, asset protection, and success planning. Glenn, I'm so excited to partner with you. Thanks for taking time from your busy schedule to share your expertise with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please help me welcome Mr. Glenn Wagstaff. Glenn, take it over.
All right. Well, Frank, thank you so much for that introduction, and I appreciate everybody being here this evening. What we're going to share tonight hopefully is valuable for you, but I guarantee you that you probably will know somebody that this information will be valuable for, right? And so that's one of the reasons that we do these presentations is that we want to inform the public. We want everybody to be aware so that they can make informed decisions. And a lot of times these are things that we don't think about on a regular basis. And unfortunately, over 80% of Americans don't have anything in place. And so this is one of the big crusades I know Frank is on and his team, and we are as well. One of the reasons that we work so closely together is because we want to get the word out and we want to empower individuals and families to make sure that they're properly protected. I know tonight we're going to talk, to a community of faith. And so we'll talk a little bit about, some of the things that impact our community, particularly, I always like to start with a story. And particularly, a lot of times we hear about people who have had a loved one pass away or, they just didn't have plans in place. And then they're going around collecting from, people's goodwill to try to help with the burial or to try to help with, final expenses or to try to help the family to restabilize. And those are sad moments. And, hopefully if we have, we give, right? But those are sad moments because if we would have just planned ahead, a lot of these things are important for pretty much everyone. And a lot of times we disqualify ourselves from proper planning because we think it doesn't apply to us. And I'm here to tell you today that it does, right? So we're going to talk about some of the basics, and then we're going to talk about some of the things that really can make a difference as you're trying to leave a legacy in life and you're trying to leave something that will survive after you're gone, right? So these 6 areas that we have on here are the 6 areas of advanced planning that we go into when we sit down with a client. And we will talk, generally about each one of these. But the idea is that, when we sit down, we don't want to just look at one aspect of your situation. We want to make sure that we're protecting you and empowering you in all aspects, right? So in addition to, on the financial side, what Frank and his team do, when we sit down and look at somebody's legal needs, we look first at incapacity planning. They say that over 72% of us are going to end up in long-term care at some point in our lives. We're going to need long-term care. And so the question is, do we know how we're going to pay for care? Or, are we expecting that our family members are going to be able to pay for it? It's an extra $70,000 or $80,000 a year that we would need just for paying for that sort of care, right? And a lot of us don't have that laying around to be able to pay for that. So the first question is, how are we going to pay for it? But if you became incapacitated and needed care like that, do you have the right documents in place to empower somebody to make necessary decisions on your behalf? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then we look at estate planning. And estate planning is all about, what do you have that you want to pass on? How is it going to transfer? And specifically, transferring it outside of the court system. Because if we have to, wait for probate, it can take a long time. It can be very expensive. It can cause a lot of stress on the family, on our loved ones, or on others that we're relying on, right? And most people want to avoid that. So transferring everything at the right time to the right people in the right way, right? Then we look at business planning. If you're a business owner, you know that it's very important, if you're not present for whatever reason, for the business to have the support it needs to be able to survive, right? Because the goodwill that you build in business can disappear very quickly if the business can't operate. So as a business owner, the question is, what would happen to your business if something happened to you? And unfortunately, most business owners don't have an answer to that question. So that's one of the things that we want to make sure of, is that you have, a proper succession plan in place. Then we look at asset protection planning. And as much as, we don't like being in a state or a location where there's a lot of litigation, where people sue each other, I got to tell you that, we're in a world where that happens a lot, right? And so you want to protect whatever wealth, whatever assets, whatever, you've built up, to make sure that you are in a place that is protected, so that if there's a car accident or whatever, that they're not going to come after everything that you own, right? And then we look at tax planning. And a lot of times people already have a tax professional. But the difference between proactive tax planning and reactive tax planning, which is what most people do, is when you show up on April 15th or before then with your tax preparer, what their job is to look at what you did last year. And based on what you did last year, try to save you money today. The problem is that they don't have a time machine. They can't go back in time and change what you did. So they have to work with whatever you actually did. That's what they have to work with. That's the menu that you've been given, right? Well, proactive tax planning is sitting down ahead of time and changing the menu, because we can actually put entities in place, shift where the income's flowing to, and all of these things, so that you can reduce your taxes when you get to your tax preparer the following year. If you don't put those things in place beforehand, then they won't have those options, right? So that's the difference between proactive tax planning and reactive tax planning. And so we do tax planning around income taxes, capital gains taxes, and estate taxes. If your estate is over a certain size, then they tax you again, right? They tax you when you earn the money, when you spend the money, if you save the money, if it grows too much, then you liquidate it, they tax you again, capital gains, right? And then when you pass away, if you have too much, then they tax you again. So there's so much, and that's what they say, you can't get away from death or taxes, right? But we can plan around it and we can minimize it, right? And then finally, what we call legacy planning, which is, leaving a legacy. Maybe it's your life stories. Maybe it's the values that you stand for. Maybe it's, that you want to leave something for the community, right? For charity. Maybe you want to, do good in the world and have that perpetuate when you're gone. Maybe you want to leave something for your church. right? There are plenty of ways to be able to leave something that will continue even after you're not there anymore. And often it can take on a life of its own, and it can, do good in the world, right? And so we help set up foundations, we help set up charitable giving, we can help with even multi-generational transfers of wealth, right? We call it the Rockefeller method, where you set something up that will continue from generation to generation to generation. It doesn't just disappear when it goes to the kids and then they spend it all. So there are ways to set that sort of thing up, right? So I share that with you as a backdrop for what we're going to share today. We're not going to talk about everything. We don't have time to, but we're going to touch on just a few things, right? And the first thing I want to share is how important it is to be prepared for emergencies. In the scriptures, it says, if you are prepared, you shall not fear, right? If you're not prepared, then we get blindsided for these emergencies. We know that they're going to happen sometime in our life, right? There's certain things that are going to happen. There's going to be, maybe times where we have medical challenges. Maybe there's going to be times, like I said, 72% of us are going to end up in long-term care at some point, right? Maybe we'll have a loved one pass away. And the thing is that we can prepare for these risks so that when the rain comes, we're on a strong foundation, we don't get just washed away, right? And so that's one of the things that we really need to think about in our planning, because like I said, most people don't have anything in place. And just simple documents, simple things that you can put in place will help to prevent the majority of these problems. So let me give you an example. When my sister was 19 years old, she was going to college. She was in her second year of college, right? She wasn't married. She didn't have any kids. She didn't have really any property. Most people would have said she didn't need an estate plan at that point in her life. But she found herself unconscious in the hospital, right? And hospital called my parents and they asked them if they had a medical directive or a healthcare power of attorney or a HIPAA authorization or anything like that. And like 80% of Americans, they didn't. So they said no. So the hospital said, well, we can't tell you anything, but your daughter's here. Why does that happen? She's 19. 19 means she's an adult. So under the eyes of the law, nobody has automatic authority to make decisions on her behalf. Does that make sense? If she hasn't put the proper documents in place to allow someone to make decisions, nobody can automatically make those decisions, even if you're the parent or even if you're the spouse. And so my parents were, they were understandably shaken, right? They drive for 2.5 hours down to where the college is or where the hospital was. And then luckily, by the time they got there, she had recovered consciousness and she was able to get permission. But, there's a law called HIPAA. So they couldn't share her private medical information unless they had that permission. Does that make sense? And so a lot of times, we rely on the goodwill of others to it's going to turn out okay, right? That's how we just see life is, oh, I don't need to worry about it. If something were to happen, well, of course I have my children or I have my wife or I have my husband or I have my parents. Of course, they're going to be able to handle things. We don't know the stress that we are preparing them to be under. Does that make sense? If you just have simple documents in place, these problems become so much easier. I'll give you another example. We had a couple from Texas, and unfortunately, the husband had a massive stroke, and it was so severe that he was going to have to relearn pretty much everything. Right? He couldn't even feed himself because he lost a lot of his motor skills and everything. Right? And so now the wife knew that she was going to be the breadwinner. They have 3 kids, right? They were a little bit older kids, but they had 3 kids, and she's going to be the one taking care of them, making decisions, taking care of things. So she assumed that she'd be able to make decisions on behalf of her husband now that he's going to be hospitalized for a few months. Well, 2 days into his hospital stay, the hospital brought her in and they sat her down and they said, unfortunately, your husband didn't have a medical power of attorney, didn't have a healthcare directive. And so you're going to need to go get a conservatorship over him. Otherwise, the hospital will be making all of the decisions for his healthcare. And she said, well, what's a conservatorship? And they said, well, you need to go talk to an attorney, right? So she meets with an attorney and starts the paperwork, and they submit it to the court. And 18 months later, 18 months, it was granted. So for 18 months, a year and a half, The hospital made all of the decisions regarding his health and his health care, whether he was in the hospital or went home, what kind of surgeries he got, what kind of treatment he got, what kind of medication he got, all of those things. And by the way, there were some things that the family was not in agreement with, but they didn't have a voice. They couldn't enforce their rights because they didn't have it in a legal form. So the hospital made all of those decisions. In contrast, there was another situation where we had somebody go into the hospital during COVID. He was older, right? He's in his 70s. Luckily, his daughter had him do a medical power of attorney beforehand. So when they wanted to take him, when they wanted to put him on oxygen, you know how it was during COVID, right? There's a lot of people that were in the hospital, and then the hospitals were, making decisions, which may or may not have been the best thing for people. The family was not in agreement to take him on, or to put him on oxygen. Because they had a medical directive, the family got to make the decision. And that's probably why he's still with us today, right? And so he was able to recover and everything turned out okay. And that's the difference. Having the right legal documents in place allows you to enforce your rights. And if you don't have those documents in place, it becomes very complicated because our legal structure is intended to, resolve issues, resolve problems through the court system. And our court system often takes a very long time. It can be very expensive, and it's a public process. And it causes a lot of stress on the family, right? So most of the time, we prefer to avoid that, but it's not going to be avoided unless we are prepared, unless we put the right documents in place. So the first thing that we recommend for pretty much everyone is a medical and a financial power of attorney. Those documents will empower somebody that you trust to make decisions on your behalf if there was an emergency situation. And then if you have minor children, it's just as important, probably even more important, to have what we call a last will and testament. Why? Because in your will, you get to do something very important. You get to decide who would be the guardian for your children. And if you can't take care of your kids for whatever reason, the state says that any interested party could be a guardian for your kids. I don't know about you, but I have some interested parties in my family that I don't want raising my kids. That makes sense? If I don't put that in writing, then the court's going to decide for me. And they might not decide the way that I would have decided. So this is, again, how we enforce our rights, how we're able to express what our wishes are and make sure that they're going to be followed. So there was a situation in Southern California, husband and wife, they go down to Mexico for the weekend, right? They left their 3-year-old and their 1-year-old with grandma. And of course, they're happy, right? Grandma had helped raise them ever since they were born. And so there's no problems. But on their way back, they were in a massive car accident. Both of them passed away. So now there is a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old that didn't have parents, needed somebody to be a guardian for them and to help raise them. And the grandma knew that her son would have wanted her to be the person to take over, right? To take care of those kids. And so she nominates herself to the court to be the guardian for the kids. And unfortunately, the judge refused to make her the guardian. He says, you live on Social Security. You live in a 1-bedroom apartment. You can't take care of these kids. We're not going to give them to you. So instead, they go into the foster care system for 4.5 months while the family comes together and all the aunts and the uncles and everybody are talking and finally nominate somebody that the court does accept. And it was one of the aunts. She gets nominated. She becomes the guardian because she owned a home and she had a good, stable income. The judge thought that she would be a good guardian. But she was single and didn't want to ever have kids. Her lifestyle was completely different from the parents, right? And it's not what the parents would have wanted. Now, what's her future going to be like? What are those kids' futures going to be like? Meanwhile, grandma's heartbroken over here because she knew that her son would have wanted her to be in charge. But it wasn't up to them. It was up to the judge. And the judge got to decide whatever the judge decided, right? And so that's the power of you being able to express your wishes in legal form so that those wishes have to be honored. And so, if you have minor children, we always recommend having a last will and testament. And then finally, once you own real estate, then we recommend having a trust. And for those of you who have heard of a revocable living trust, sometimes we think, oh, well, that's for rich people, right? You have to have a mansion, you have to have a 7-car garage or whatever before you need that. The reality is, if you own any real estate, you probably need a trust, because it will end up in probate if you don't have the right structure in place. If you own over $100,000 of assets that don't have a beneficiary designated, you probably need a trust, because it will be at risk of going through probate, depending on what state you're in. If you have minor children or minor beneficiaries that you're going to leave things to, then you probably need a trust, because a minor can't receive assets. They have to be over 18 to receive assets. So we had a situation where there was actually, this was something that one of our attorneys in her community of faith, right, somebody from church, passed away, and they had gotten a final expense life insurance policy, which is a good thing to have, right? Because it can help pay for final expenses. Normally, those policies pay out very quickly, because they know that you need the money to be able to pay for the burial and everything else. But unfortunately, this man had put his 2 granddaughters as his beneficiaries. Sounds like a good idea. They're probably going to survive him, right? Unfortunately, one of them passed away before he did, and the other one was 17 years old. So now they go to collect the life insurance money, and the life insurance company says, we can't pay this to the 17-year-old because somebody has to go to court and become a guardian or conservator over her first. So instead of getting the payout for final expenses for being able to do the burial and everything else, they had to go and open up a court case and wait for the money. It was going to take months. So what did they end up doing? They ended up passing the hat, right? Asking everybody to contribute a little bit, because they didn't have the funds to be able to pay for his burial. And now the church was responsible for helping. So that this is what happens when we don't have a proper plan. And it's important in most of these scenarios that you have a revocable living trust, because what happens when you have a trust is that you can avoid the court system. So probate can take a long time. It can cost a lot of money. It can cause a lot of stress on the family. It's a public process. But when you set up a trust, you can bypass all of that. You choose somebody that you can trust, somebody that you can rely on, and they step into the role of trustee when you're no longer able to run the trust. So most of the time when you set up a trust, you're going to be your own trustee. If you're married, it's probably going to be you and your spouse, right? But at some point, when you can't serve as trustee anymore, you get to choose somebody to step into your shoes. And they don't have to ask permission from a judge, and they don't have to go through a court process, and there's really no delays for that. And they're able to then step in and manage things. And if you have minor children, they can manage the assets for the children until they're old enough to receive it. Maybe you don't even want them to receive it as soon as they turn 18, because what's an 18-year-old going to do with $1 million? I know what I would have done, right? And maybe it wasn't the wisest of things at that time, right? And so if you want to provide guidelines on when they receive the funds, what they use those funds for, how it's supposed to be spent, you can do that in your trust. You can actually specify, okay, I don't want them to get it all when they turn 18, but maybe, when they're 21, they can get 25%. And when they're 25, they can get 50%. And when they're 30, they can get all of it. You could do that. Or if you want to specify, this money's for college, or this money's for a mission trip, or this money's for, taking care of the grandchildren, or whatever, you can do that. Maybe you have somebody in the family that if they were to receive assets directly would actually hurt them, because you might have somebody who's, has special needs that's receiving government benefits. If they receive an inheritance directly, they can lose those benefits. So there are ways to plan around that. We can, build protections into the plan so that someone can manage it for them and so that they don't lose their benefits. Maybe you have somebody who's not good with money, right? There's what we call a spendthrift. They would waste it on drugs or alcohol, or we know the story of the prodigal son, right? They receive it and they wouldn't use it for the wisest of choices. again, we can put somebody else managing it for them. And then they can make those decisions and manage it on their behalf to make sure that it's going to be used for the right things. And the thing is that a lot of times we just assume that when we're dead and gone, we wouldn't care what happens because we're no longer on this earth. We're no longer worried about it, right? I've had a lot of clients say to me, when I'm gone, what do I care what they do with the money? It's just money. Can't take it with me. Let them waste it. Let them spend it. Or it doesn't matter. But given the right circumstances, most of us would be rolling over in our graves if the money's used in the wrong ways, right? Just imagine you leave the inheritance to your kids, and all of a sudden one of them goes through a divorce, and the ex-spouse ends up with all the inheritance. We wouldn't want that to happen, right? There are ways to protect the inheritance from that happening. Or what if, it goes to one of them, and all of a sudden all of their friends are spending it on drugs and alcohol and everything else, right? Or they're turning your home into something that you wouldn't want. These are all things that we can specify in the trust to make sure that they don't happen. And we can put, guidelines that do make sense, that reflect your values. So that's part of the power of having a properly structured plan. The next thing I want to talk about is, self-reliance. Because if you have the right plan in place, you don't have to depend on others when these problems and when these issues come up, right? And a lot of times, once we set up our plan, we just assume that a simple will or a simple trust is good enough for everybody, right? One of the things that we're very particular about is that estate planning is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Sometimes a simple plan can address everything you need, but sometimes you need other things. That's why we have like irrevocable trusts that can help you to minimize taxes or to qualify for benefits like Medicaid benefits, right? Or to be able to protect your assets from lawsuits and liabilities. We can set up structures for passing on your business or passing on assets like cryptocurrency or other things that you might not know what to do with, right? And these are the types of things that need to be specifically looked at to make sure that your plan is going to function properly. So a lot of times, when people kind of go through the motions, they just say, well, we'll just leave everything to the kids. We'll just leave it all equally. That may or may not actually reflect what you want to have happen. In fact, I remember sitting down with one of my clients and he said, I asked him, how do you want to leave everything when you pass away? He said, what's the most common? I said, well, what's most common is they leave it equally for the kids. And he said, yeah, but sometimes equal's not fair. That was an interesting statement, right? That stuck with me because he explained that he had 3 kids. One of the kids was very wise with their money, very successful. They owned a bigger house than he did. They're comfortable. Everything's good, right? He's not worried about it. He doesn't need to leave anything for him. Even if he left it for him, it might not do anything for their lifestyle, for their standard of living, right? His second child was a single mom. She has 2 kids that she's trying to raise by herself. She has a small home. She has some support network and everything around her, but she's always struggling to be able to, get by, right? And he says, she could probably use more help than the first one. But he says the third child was my, wayward child, he said, right? She is, not really found a career path. She's, done things that, maybe we wouldn't have preferred that she did. Has some drug problems and stuff like that. She's going to need somebody to take care of her share, but she's the one that needs the most help. She doesn't own a home. She'll probably never be able to own a home on her own. She, doesn't even have a car, right? We want to make sure she's taken care of, but we don't want to put her in a position where she's just going to blow it all either. So sometimes equal is not fair because if we just give it equally, what would happen in those 3 scenarios? One of them is going to waste all the money in less than 6 months, which is, by the way, the average, national average. If it's $10,000 or $10 million, it doesn't matter. On average, in less than 7 months, it's all going to be spent unless you have proper guidelines in place, right? The second one is probably going to use it for some good. Maybe it'll last for a while, right? It put them in a better situation. maybe it'd be a big blessing to them, right? And the third one, it might not even do anything, but they're probably going to have enough that they can pass it on to the next generation. So usually what happens is that within 3 generations, no matter how big an estate is, it's going to be gone. They say rags to rags in 3 generations. So if you don't want that to happen, you can specify what you do want to happen. You can actually leave an estate that will continue from generation to generation to generation. And by the way, you don't have to be an ultra millionaire to do this. Let me give you another example. I had a great aunt and a great uncle, and they were great, but they were also my great aunt and great uncle. They didn't have any kids, and so when they passed away, they didn't have any natural beneficiaries or heirs that they were going to leave things to, right? And what was important to them was their church. They wanted to leave, a legacy of giving, and they wanted to leave as much as they could when they passed away. And I don't even know exactly how they did this, other than they explained it to me at one point, because we wanted to make sure that they had things in place. But essentially, they never earned more than 50,000-70,000 a year in their working lifetimes, right? But what they did was they would save up a little bit every year until they had enough to be able to purchase an annuity, and then have that annuity pay in on a monthly basis or an annual basis for a life insurance policy. And they got the biggest life insurance policy they could get. And then they would name the church as the beneficiary. So when they passed away, again, this is a pretty modest household. They lived in an apartment. They earned maybe 70,000 a year. By the time they passed away, they left $15 million for their church. They would have never been able to save that up by themselves, but they knew what kind of a legacy they wanted to leave. So they planned ahead. And if you want to leave a legacy of money, it's really easy. You get the biggest life insurance policy that you could afford, you're going to leave a lot of money. But the problem with just leaving money is that money's like water. If you don't direct it, if you don't, push it to the right things, it'll go through your fingers. And just like we said, in 6 or 7 months, it'll all disappear. So along with the money, you have to leave your expression of values. What's important to you? What's the legacy of values that you want to leave? And you have to leave an explanation for why that's important, right? Because your children or your loved ones, they might not understand or have the same values as you do, but they'll have to respect your wishes if it's in writing in legal form, right? If you express what your values are and how you want it to be used, they're probably going to honor that. And if you give the context of your own personal stories and where those values come from, then it might do even more than that. It might transform them to adopt those values, to become better, right? There's a great movie, if you haven't seen it, it's called The Ultimate Gift. I recommend it for everybody. That movie will help you to understand the power of an effective plan to be able to leave a legacy that not just blesses the beneficiaries that are going to receive it, but also helps them to transform into better people. It's a really wealthy guy that ends up passing away. He leaves a video will, right? He actually speaks to his grandson, and he's telling him all of his regrets and why he wants to leave his inheritance. And he leaves him 10 gifts, and each gift represents one of his values in life. It's a great movie. If you get a chance to go watch that movie. So the last thing that I want to share with everybody, we're going to open it up for some question and answer here, is the power of leaving a legacy. Because a lot of times, we just assume that we don't have enough to be able to do that. But again, if you want to leave a legacy of wealth, it's very easy. You can do it through life insurance vehicles. You can leave a lot of assets. And it's interesting because we're seeing the first generation of minority millionaires passing away. If there's effective planning, that wealth will continue from generation to generation. If not, it'll disappear very quickly, right? There were 2 families, the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. And these families are not just known for, being very wealthy. They were some of the most wealthy families in the world at the time, but they're also families that ended up establishing a reputation of giving, right? They established universities and museums and Carnegie Hall and, all these different things, right? But when the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers passed away, right, John D. Rockefeller had a specific idea of what he wanted for his wealth. He wanted to leave a legacy that would continue forever. And so he didn't just leave it to the family. He kept the wealth concentrated. He left it in trust. And then he put a committee of the family members, along with some professionals, to come together and make decisions on behalf of that wealth. And every generation, it would refill itself because the family members would go and get a life insurance policy on themselves. And then that policy would pay into the family trust when they passed away. So every generation, it refills itself, right? The Vanderbilts did what most of us do, which is just leave everything equally to the kids. So when they pass away, in 3 generations, the Vanderbilts' wealth was completely gone. And now the Rockefeller family is still one of the most powerful, one of the most wealthy families in the United States. That's the difference. That's the difference in leaving a legacy or not really planning effectively for the future, right? And so I just leave this with you because, this is a time of giving. We're here at Christmas time, right? This is a time that a lot of times we're thinking of others. We're thinking of giving gifts. We're thinking about, maybe even making donations end of year. We do a lot of tax planning at the end of the year, work with a lot of nonprofits. If any of that is interesting to you and you wanted to sit down and have a consultation, we'll offer a complimentary free consultation to sit down and do a review with you of what your needs are. We want you to be informed to be able to make effective decisions, proper decisions for your futures. But this is also a time of reflection. What does our life mean? What kind of values do we want to leave behind? What's important for us? Maybe you're going to make goals for the next year, for 2025. But let's think about our legacies. What do we want to leave? How do we want to leave it? What lives do we want to impact when we're gone? And the ripples that we create in this world, they're going to perpetuate. And the more you plan, the more likely that those ripples are going to continue and create big waves of change, of difference, of legacy, of, all kinds of things. Whatever's important to you, you can manifest that in the future and future generations if you plan properly. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Frank. And Frank, if anybody has any questions, they can put it here in the chat.
Awesome, Glenn. Thank you so much for delivering this special training for us at this webinar. So I know you covered a lot, and I'm sure our audience has some questions. And so, guys, if you have questions, just put them in the chat so Glenn can take care of it for us. And so go ahead, guys. If you have questions, please do so.
And actually, I just want to make one last gift for everybody who came on with us tonight. I know, again, I appreciate that you're here with us on an evening here towards the end of the year. If you're interested, send us a message here in the chat, and we will send you a copy of a very good book. It's called What the Rockefellers Would Do. And we have it in digital form, and we'll send it to you as a gift for being here with us tonight.
Okay, Glenn. So let me start off the questions. I have a question for you, and it's been asked several times. What do you do with the small stuff? Let's say you have some sports gear, you have, golf gear or jewelry somewhere. Would you put that in your trust? How do you handle that kind of those things?
So all of those things are going to be generally assigned to your trust. So they'll be in your trust. It's usually not a big deal. And for the most part, it'll just be divided among your beneficiaries, however you decide. But one of the things that's interesting that I think is important is you can actually specify if you want to leave something specific to specific people through a memorandum. We give you a memorandum when we do planning, right? That you would actually write in, this goes to so-and-so and this goes to so-and-so. And the reason we do that is because sometimes the biggest fights are not over the money. It's over the sentimental items. There might be some things that everybody wants, right? So for example, when my great grandfather passed away, everybody wanted his Bible. Everybody wanted his board game collection. Everybody wanted his I forget what else it was. Like there was some antiques that he had, right? Some pioneer antiques. Nobody wanted the farm. That's another story, right? But a lot of times the fights are over sentimental items. And then when there's hurt feelings and everybody's, upset with each other, and it was like, it wasn't even about the money. It was about we had a situation where there was two sisters. They were raised by their grandparents. And when the grandma passed away, there was a $5 hairbrush that she used to use to comb their hair, brush their hair every night when she would put them to bed. That's what they were fighting over, the two sisters. They spent $20,000 each fighting over that hairbrush. That's what happens sometimes, right? So if there's sentimental items, things like that, you can specify who you leave it to. Otherwise, yeah, it's pretty easy to leave things just in general to everybody.
Thank you, Glenn. Does anybody have more questions?
We have a couple questions here. One of them was revocable versus irrevocable in a trust. Is that strictly for creditor protection or more for tax? I know you mentioned to have the trust revocable. So most of the time we use irrevocable trust only if you need special protections for, it might be for asset protection, it might be for tax planning, it might be for qualifying for benefits. But the problem with irrevocable is it's called irrevocable because you can't really make changes to it, right? But you have to give up control and put somebody else in charge of it in order to get those protections. So a lot of times people aren't ready to do that with everything that they have. And so it becomes more complicated to do that. So in general, just to plan around probate and to make sure things transfer properly, revocable is good enough. That's what most people need. And you can change it, you can put things in, you can take things out, you can get rid of it if you want. But irrevocable we use just for specific circumstances, and it's important to meet with a professional that knows what they're doing if you're going to do an irrevocable plan.
Yeah, we have a couple more questions. Bronson asked, what type of attorney should my wife and I consult about trusts, wills, and POAs?
So you want to consult specifically an estate planning attorney, right? And our firm does work all over the United States. We have hundreds of attorneys that work with us, but there are often attorneys that specialize just in estate planning. Those are the ones that are going to know how to advise you best. Not all attorneys are created equal, right? Even though we're all empowered to practice every area of law. A lot of times you'll sit down with the general practitioner and they don't really understand estate planning, so they might not advise you in the best way possible. But what we recommend is actually sitting down with someone who specializes in estate planning. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So, Greg, we have another question. We have a question from Zeke. Zeke asked, he says, I have a living trust, but I'd like some more information on the other stuff. How do we handle that?
Yeah, so just reach out to whoever invited you tonight. They can schedule an appointment for you. There's no cost for the consultation. We'll do a review of those 6 areas and we'll make some recommendations. And if it makes sense to help you, then we'll be here to help.
Awesome. And then we have Charles. Charles asks, do you do investments?
So that's why we partner with Frank and his team, right? Because they're very good at advising on the financial side. And by the way, just recently, there was an interview with Tucker Carlson was interviewing. He's like a really famous broadcaster. I forget his name. Anyway, the question was, what's the most important thing that people need in today's world? And his answer was very interesting. He said, the most important thing is that you have a trusted financial professional that you can go to with your questions, with your issues, and that sort of thing. Because in today's world, there's so many crazy, financial things happening that if you don't have somebody advising you on that, you need to have somebody, right? Then he said, the second thing is you need a trusted legal professional, because there's so many liabilities and all kinds of stuff that comes up that if you don't have a legal professional, that, you know, the average person probably breaks 3 laws a day, right? You need somebody that you could rely on to advise you properly on the legal side. And then he says the third most important thing is to have a trusted medical professional. And this was during the time of COVID, right? So he was, you know, talking about how it's so important to have a trusted medical professional that could advise you properly for your own needs, not just in general what the whole world should do, but for you, right? And so we would say the same. It's important to have your team of professionals working together, right? Your financial guy, your tax guy, your legal guy, have them all talking so that you will get the best results.
Awesome, awesome, that's great. So those of you, some of you have requested the ebook. So if anybody else wants to get an ebook, just you know, put that in the chat and we'll get that out to you based on your registration. All right, any more questions?
So I think we're good at this point. Frank, thank you so much for scheduling this, for preparing this, and, you know, inviting people to be here with us this evening. And for everybody, you know, have a great holiday season. Have a Merry Christmas. And you know, as you're preparing for the end of the year, you know, this is the gift that keeps giving, not just immediately, but for generations to come, right? So we just want to make sure that everybody gets the right information and that they're equipped for it. And if you know somebody that needs this, you know, refer them to whoever invited you tonight, and we'd be happy to extend that same free consultation for them as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Glenn. And I mean, taking the time away from your busy schedule, that says a lot. And I appreciate the value that you brought to us tonight. So good night, guys. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your holidays.